Good morning, everybody. So thank you for joining our webinar today on eliminating human risk cyber resilience with our BITES partner, Proofpoint. My name is Michael Holden, and I am the marketing assistant at BITES Security Partnerships. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tim Ricketts and Simon Pardee, who will be taking us through the majority of today's presentation. So the agenda for the day, I'll be giving a short intro on BITES, then I'll go through some of the discussion points, introduce today's guest speakers, who will then take us through email fraud defense and Proofpoint security awareness training, after which there will be a Q&A. But first, some housekeeping. So all attendee lines will be on mute throughout the session, and there will be a Q&A at the end, as mentioned. Please post questions in the chat box or the question box, and then I will field these to the presenters at the end of the discussion. This is a strategic discussion, and there will be no commercials. If you would like to discuss these, you can discuss these with BITES account manager afterwards. I will also be sending the recording to everybody after the session. There will also be a feedback survey at the end. If you could please fill this out so that we could make sure that these webinars are hitting the mark. So, who are BITES? BITES Security Partnerships are the security specialist partner in the BITES group in the UK. We aim to marry up the agility and insight and the personal approach from the smallest specialist partner with the scale and scope that comes with being part of a much larger group. We are proud here at BITES Security Partnerships of the technical expertise we have around the solutions we offer, and that allows us to enjoy top-tier vendor partnerships, which also allows us to deliver for customers on the technical and the commercial sides. We work across the full spectrum of information security, from perimeter and next-gen firewall through to cloud and mobile security, data security, and access and authentication, offering both hardware and software solutions. What we offer and add value to businesses and vendor partner solutions is via the technical suite of services that we are able to deploy, whether that's looking at security strategy deployment, technology mapping, project scoping, planning and delivery, or 24/7 direct-to-engineer support. There are a myriad of ways in which we can act as an extension of your IT team to make sure that the solutions you deploy add value quickly. But that's enough about us. So today we will be talking about why we need to protect people in the organization, and that's because they're only human and will still make mistakes. In order to help this, we need security training, or security awareness training, and which has not been a traditional thing for most companies. Most security awareness training usually ends with a test, which is not always the best way. And it is also important to use technology to support this training to ensure that no attacks hit as few as possible attacks hit the inbox. As I've said, today we're joined by Tim Ricketts and Simon Pardee from Proofpoint, who are experts in EFD and PSAT. Proofpoint are a cloud-based email security company who are specialists in fighting advanced cyber threats via email. Proofpoint blocks threats in 600 million emails and 7 million apps every day. And they have a cloud-based approach to securing cloud email. Now we're going to go over to Tim Ricketts.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much everyone for joining this morning. My name is Tim Ricketts. I'm an engineer with Proofpoint, and I'm going to talk first of all about eliminating human risk. So before we get into the guts of email fraud defense, which is part of our solution set, I just really wanted to frame the issues that we see today. So We'll talk a little bit about who Proofpoint are for those that don't know us, and we're going to look a little bit at why some, I guess, traditional security approaches don't necessarily match the attackers' methods that we're seeing at the moment. Attackers are using business email compromise and social engineering in quite a massive way that is accelerating fast in its usage. So clearly, the attackers feel that something that they are doing is earning them money, and we're going to dig into that as well. And we're going to have a look at our email fraud defense solution, which is one of the key pillars of defending against spoofing and business email compromise attacks. And then I'll hand over to my colleague Simon, who is a security awareness specialist, and he's going to talk about using training to educate users and to reduce the risk. So first of all, who is Proofpoint? Well, we have over 70% of the Fortune 100 are customers for our email security platform, and that number is growing very, very fast. So we are a global organization, and we service the needs of the largest organizations in the world all the way down to the smallest. We have over 7,000 enterprise customers, and are very proud to say that we have a more than 93% renewal rate with our customer base. The key reason that we have such a high renewal rate is because of our very, very high reinvestment back into R&D. So 23% of revenue from Proofpoint goes back into research and development. We own all of our own technology stacks, and we develop everything ourselves. We acquire new technologies and integrate them. So this high reinvestment into R&D allows us to do this and to pivot very, very quickly whenever we see attackers changing their tactics. We integrate with a large number of other security ecosystem vendors. We don't believe that we should be the sole solution that people employ inside of their organizations. So we have strategic partnerships with the like of Palo Alto, Splunk, CyberArk, Imperva, and others. IBM QRadar, for example, those are typical points at which we can integrate and add value into those platforms as well. So let's get on to the topic itself, defenders versus attackers. Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say that currently cybersecurity is not without its failings. Hardly a day goes by when we don't see something in the news with regards to a breach. Now, these breaches all occur in a variety of different ways, but most commonly the weak link or the start of the attack begins with a human doing something inadvertently. And we're going to relate this back to the tactics that the attackers are using. So in terms of, I guess, a traditional approach to defending a network, organizations really have seen this in a very simplistic way. You have a number of different layers. You have your applications internally, your databases, your file shares, your intranet, your various network segments, and you can put up boundary controls there and controls on your application and operating systems and that sort of thing. That's all very simple, all very straightforward, and that's indeed how we, rolling back a few years, would have seen the security environment, and a successful layered defense was what was required in order to protect your users and to protect your intellectual property and assets. However, the world has changed. The likes of Office 365 has come along, for example. Vastly accelerated use of mobile devices and users operating outside of the corporate borders has really blurred the network boundaries. So although we're not saying you should ditch a traditional layered defense for your corporate network and your core assets that you hold on premises, but clearly there is a lot of work to be done with emulating those controls for both your users and cloud applications that sit outside of your internal network. The attackers view the world very, very differently to what I just showed you. So the attackers these days really are focusing on the users themselves as opposed to the use of remote exploits to target a web server, for example. There is a very, very simple reason for this. The pool of exploits available to attackers has reduced quite drastically. This is because of better secure coding practices and better awareness from developers as to what is deemed to be insecure coding. Now, I'm not saying for a second that things are perfect in that respect, but the reduced pool of exploits means that the relative value of each exploit has gone up. So if you don't happen to be the exploit owner, but you want to use an exploit, as an attacker, you will have to buy it, perhaps off the dark web, for example. But the cost of these exploits has gone up because there aren't that many of them around in comparison to a few years ago that are still going to give you a high infection rate. So attackers really have pivoted to go and look at other ways to get into organizations. The weak link is clearly the person behind the keyboard. That much is very, very true now, but it was also true 20, 30 years ago. If you look at attackers of old, of note, the likes of Kevin Mitnick, for example, they admitted themselves that perhaps they weren't technically the best attackers, but they were very, very good at social engineering and getting people to trust them and do things on their behalf. The methodology of the social engineering, or its delivery, has changed, but the basic principle is the same even now. So we see here on this particular slide a number of different types of users. Now, the first one is an obvious target. It's the CEO of an organization. They have quite a profile online. The company may post things about what the events the CEO is at, or delivering a speech at, or that sort of thing. From an attacker's perspective, that gives you a great idea of what he's interested in and where he is physically, and who the kinds of people that he's talking to and the topics that he talks about. So you're able to start building up a reconnaissance profile about that person, and that helps you to understand from a social engineering perspective what kinds of topics and lures you may want to include to actually engage that person and therefore build up trust and get them to do something on your behalf. The other two users are slightly less obvious. In this fictitious example, we have a loan officer at a bank. So anyone that has some kind of privileged access to resources which have value can be considered a target. That target is then elevated if that person happens to have a social media profile themselves, which is perhaps too noisy, giving too much away, or if they're a long-standing employee. Both of those things can contribute to an elevated level of risk and therefore an elevated level of attempts to subvert them via social engineering. The third example there is a financial filing analyst, so a relatively junior role, but seniority is no guarantee or no direct mapping as to the types of attack and approaches that can be used by the attackers. This particular person has access to privileged information ahead of time and is therefore of value to an attacker. So thinking about the person's role is very, very important. So it kind of amounts to this, really. Dave here is the weak link, no matter how many different technical controls you can put in place, because if Dave trusts an attacker, then you don't need to really bypass that stuff because he's doing it for you. So infrastructure attacks are becoming less common. Attacks against people are where you wanted to start your attack. You don't necessarily have to try and break into infrastructure directly if you can get hold of the correct credentials and access through the individual. The shift to cloud has kind of muddied that a little bit because a lot of the cloud-based applications don't offer out of the box enough deep access controls or multi-factor controls to be able to prevent these kinds of attacks. So in the case of a lot of cloud applications, it's very, very easy for an attacker to go and do things like brute force or dictionary-based attacks against user profiles, and there is nothing in place to stop them there. So the move to the cloud has prompted a lot of questions from companies with regards to how do we get back the security controls that we have for the equivalent applications when they were on premises. As a result, in the success and the scale of the losses on behalf of companies, from an attacker's perspective, business email compromise has been a huge success and it continues to get worse. For that reason, it's something which is a board level issue. So what are attackers actually doing? So there's three main methodologies that they're using. The first one is getting a user to run attackers' code for them. Typically, that would be something like basic social engineering and document naming of an attachment that comes in via email, for example. and the person runs the document or tries to open the document, and a combination of macros, VBA, and PowerShell will lead to compromising the machine. And from that point on, the user is owned, and then second stage malware, potentially, and other downloaders can be instigated, and the attacker can gain a foothold on that machine. That's an attachment-based approach. With URLs, in particular phishing attacks, the main aim is to get credentials handed over. So if you emulate or you clone an Office 365 login page, for example, if your lure is good enough, then you can get someone to go to that login page, provide credentials, and then effectively that user is owned. What you then do as an attacker from that point on depends on what you want to achieve. You can just sit there, listen and watch and read the user's inbox and understand their relationships with other colleagues or external suppliers, for example, understand what it is that you can steal from them, and then you can inject yourself into the conversation at the right time to be able to carry out whatever theft you want to carry out. So it may be a timely request for a change of supplier banking details, for example, as part of an ongoing email thread that already exists that is legitimate. The ultimate aim with that sort of thing is to transfer funds or data. Sometimes attackers don't bother with any kind of phishing URL or any kind of attachment-based threat at all. They use purely social engineering, so low-volume, crafted emails which have natural language and no actual threat inside of them, but they are merely using a conversation with the recipient to be able to build up trust and then to get them to do something on their behalf. So what constitutes a very attacked person? Because a very attacked person is a different entity to a VIP, a very important person. When our customers ask us who we should be focusing on in terms of protection, we will say you should look at your VIPs because they do have access to various types of information at quite a high access level. But similarly, you need to have a look at the profile of the other employees, because it may be that some of those employees have an even higher risk level and are going to be targeted much more than your VIPs purely because of their job role. A great example of that would be PAs. PAs are some of the most attacked people in any organization because they effectively hold the keys to the calendars and communication and requests that go to one or more execs. So you need to consider what the person has access to in terms of their privilege. You need to understand more about what employees' risk profiles are. Are they working in high-risk ways? Are they not doing things like security awareness training, for example, so they have a higher propensity to click on threats? Are they using risky cloud services? Are they too noisy on social media? Are they giving too much away about your organization? So there's a number of different aspects that you need to consider. For example, from our own analysis of our own environment, because we are able to run our own statistics from our own threat analysis systems against ourselves, we see this. So for example, the attack index statistics that we produced obviously highlighted our CEO. We would expect that. If you go online in public resources, you can build up a profile of what he does. He's an avid runner, he's an art collector. We know this through public things. Someone who's just investigating him will be able to find that out without doing anything illegal. But other internal users who don't have any kind of external profile, they give away very little on LinkedIn, they don't post things publicly on behalf of the company, also happen to be targets which have been flagged as a high risk. One of them being a colleague of mine, Scott, who's manager of enterprise services. He has a high level of system access, and attackers have somehow worked this out from a limited LinkedIn profile and guessed that by his job role that he may be a target of interest. And similarly, one of our HR team in EMEA has also been flagged. And it's not a particularly high up in HR job role, but HR individuals or HR employees nearly always have a good level of access into employee PII. So I'd say this only really to get you thinking about the types of job role that you may want to consider investigating in terms of do they have the correct access levels as opposed to excessive access levels, and should I be, when I'm performing my threat analysis and triage, prioritizing those kinds of job roles and those job functions, because potentially those are the people that could cause inadvertently the most damage to my organization. In terms of what we see globally, this is really just a very brief look at how the threat landscape has changed over the years. We see elevated levels of phishing. That incorporates business email compromise. Business email compromise has been very successful, so we see it accelerating very, very quickly. We also see an increased use of remote access Trojans as well, which, rolling back a few years, tended to be the preserve of nation-state type actors, and now remote access Trojans are highly commoditized, which is a particularly disturbing trend because the capability of your average rat is extremely high, ranging from key logging and screen grabbing, banker Trojan modules. There's an awful lot of capability that you can provide once you have a stable base with a rat installed on a victim's machine. The one thing that most of these threats have in common, though, is that they have some form of social engineering lure attached to them. So in order to get these things to run, most attackers are relying on the human rather than exploits. Proofpoint focused very much on this kind of people-centric reporting. So we have the ability to create risk indexes of the type that you see above here, which can flag certain job roles and the types of threats that they're getting. So we're able to shine a light on really who is getting targeted in your organization. Being able to do that kind of profiling allows you to be more targeted in the way that you can deliver training, for example, security awareness training to those people. So, business email compromise. It is a board level business risk for very good reason. This is the FBI statistics for last year. There was a reported $12.5 billion loss across 150 countries. This is just their statistics primarily, and the true number is likely to be far, far higher globally because not everything is reported to the FBI. So this is why it's such a big risk. Some of the losses that we've seen have been absolutely enormous. These are only as far as 2017. There have been significant losses, of course, since then, and many of them. But these are the things that make the headlines, and that is not good for business. In terms of tactics that are employed, there are three main ways in which they try to present a spoofed identity to individuals to try and trick them into thinking that they're talking with someone else. So the first method is domain-based spoofing. That is very, very simple to perpetrate. It's one of the most widely used tactics by attackers. Second is a lookalike or typo squat domain, which looks very similar to a legitimate domain. Technically, it's not spoofing because an attacker can own the domain, but once they start sending out emails that are designed to look like they're coming from the original company, then it becomes a malicious act. The third method employed by attackers is display name spoofing, which is particularly effective when emails are read on mobile devices, because quite often you don't see so much sender information when rendered on a mobile screen, and so it's harder to pick out that that is a spoofed email. So domain-based spoofing and display name spoofing are the main business email compromise tactics. In terms of your defenses, the main step jump you can make in your email security is to deploy DMARC. So DMARC is a standard which sits around SPF and DKIM, and it makes SPF and DKIM more stringent, more usable, and it provides reporting around success and failure of authentication. So we're going to walk through that whole process. First of all, you need to work on protecting your assets, and you need to, in order to do this, you need to have visibility of who the targets are, and of course, who your legitimate senders are. So you need to establish controls by standardizing things like your email authentication. So why hasn't this been done before? SPF and DKIM by themselves have been around for a long time, but they haven't really been sort of widely adopted as active controls, and for a variety of reasons. So SPF basically is a way to list IP addresses of authorized senders in a DNS record, and if the sending email isn't listed in that record, then the email can fail SPF authentication. However, a lot of organizations, when they're doing that SPF inspection, they don't really trust in it and control by itself, and therefore they apply a soft fail to it, which is not actually outright rejecting the email. Similarly with DKIM, DKIM is a way of signing outbound emails, and again, its adoption has not been across the board. The lack of reporting visibility around what recipient gateways are actually doing in terms of email verification and email authentication verification has not been possible solely through the use of these protocols by themselves. So just because an email fails SPF doesn't mean it's going to be blocked. It breaks when a message is forwarded, and it does nothing to protect you from the spoofing of the display name of the header from address. So the SPF check is not going deep enough by itself. Similarly, DKIM adoption is spotty, which basically means that because it's not an heavily adopted standard across the board, doesn't mean that it's not fraudulent if it doesn't contain a DKIM signature. So it's not a universally reliable way of authenticating the identity of the sender. So DMARC sits across SPF and DKIM, and it provides that reporting visibility. It does this via the application of a DMARC DNS record, and that DNS record, whenever anyone who is signed up to submit DMARC data, whenever any of those ISPs encounter an email that has a DMARC record, that DMARC record will tell you where to send the reporting metadata to about the success or failure of the email authentication process. DMARC email authentication goes deeper than just SPF. It's looking at alignment, so envelope has to match the mail from address, for example, and we're doing deeper checks with regards to DKIM as well. So the DMARC standard, A, is a more stringent check that keeps those SPF and DKIM results honest and provides a greater accuracy there and a greater stringency to the authentication outcome, and it provides a mechanism for collating all of the authentication results into one place. And it's that collection into one place and that visibility which makes DMARC work, because understanding across your email ecosystem, both internal and external, who is allowed to send as your domain and who is not allowed to send as your domain, having that visibility of when those transactions or those authentication checks occur means that you can understand which of your legitimate third-party senders, for example, that are allowed to use your domain are failing authentication checks. You can address those failures and then you can move forward. The idea of DMARC is to basically say, I have a handle on who my legitimate senders are who are allowed to send using my domain both internally and externally. I've corrected all of their sending behavior so that they pass authentication checks. Now I'm going to flick the switch on my DMARC DNS record to say reject anyone that now fails that DMARC check. And it has a dramatic effect that we're going to look into in a while. So that sounds great, but why haven't organizations done this already? Well, the simple reason is that if you try and do it yourself, DMARC is actually a very hard thing to implement. It takes time, it takes resource, it takes a lot of understanding of the data that you're looking at to interpret the nuances in it. And if you get it wrong, then there is a high risk of blocking legitimate mail. That comes about if you don't have the visibility, the requisite visibility to be able to understand who your legitimate senders are that are failing authentication checks before you flick the switch to reject on DMARC. So the net is it's hard, and Proofpoint aim to get our customers around all of those hurdles, and I'll explain a little bit more about that shortly. So this is a very, very brief look at the email fraud defense portal. You'll see two graphs in the middle there, suspicious messages and legitimate activity. And what you should aim to look at is kind of counterintuitive in the world of DMARC. You don't focus on the bad stuff, you focus on the good stuff. So you can see the legitimate activity there. We have a bar chart with a number of yellow bars on it, which are legitimate email senders' authentication failures. Proofpoint has a part of the email fraud defense solution, a dedicated consultant that would be assigned on a per customer basis. They walk you through the nature of those legitimate sender authentication failures and advise you on, if they're internal, how you can correct them. If they're external senders, such as Salesforce or ServiceNow or those types of organizations that are sending email as you, they advise on what you need to do in order to correct the sending behavior. This is an iterative process, and over time, what happens is the failure rate comes down and down and down until it is virtually zero. At that point, you know that you're ready to flick the switch to reject, and then the suspicious message levels go away. The remainder get blocked. So it's very dramatic in how it can work, and I'll show you a real-world example in a second. So you can see who's blocking your suspicious messages. You can understand the various policies across your domains, and you can understand what type of data you're looking at, because there's three types. You have DMARC data that is provided by consumer mailbox providers, Gmail, Yahoo, AOL, so on and so forth. Then you have Proofpoint effectively as an ISP themselves. We're scanning billions of emails on a daily basis, and we're doing DMARC evaluations against all of them. So the metadata from all of those transactions is also available to us. Completely different data set to consumer. It's more about business-to-business email, so it's more likely to capture transactions with your partners and your supply chain. You then have your own internal inbound gateway data as well. So inbound gateway data is different again. You can perform DMARC checks at the gateway, but consolidating that data into one data set inside of email fraud defense means that you've got effectively 360-degree coverage for all of the different types of data available inside of EFD. And visibility is everything, because once you've got that visibility, it means that you have an idea of who all of your legitimate third-party and shadow IT potential senders are, and you can gain control of them, and then you can start to reject messages that don't conform to your authentication standards. So let's have a look at a real-world example. This is a customer of ours, a government agency, and you can see on the right-hand side they're getting spoofed on that domain from pretty much every country in the world. Very, very large entity. They have, in this particular time period, which is what, 4 months, nearly 15 million messages, which are considered to be suspicious, and only 1% of those are being blocked. Let's zoom in on where we start to get radio silence on this graph. In the meantime, before going to reject on DMARC, they've got volumes of around 200,000 emails every day abusing their domain. So these are all primarily consumer-based spoofing, but at certain times a year, you also get huge spikes over 1 million emails per day, which are pretending to come from this particular domain. So it's a bad situation, but let's have a look at where it all starts to go right. Let's zoom in into November. It's looking like it's going to be a normal month in terms of spoofed email activity. There's nearly 1 million messages for that month, virtually nothing being blocked. And the DMARC reject policy, after a lot of work, is implemented on November the 24th. So behavior then changes dramatically. You can see for the same time period that I showed you at the start of this example, which was 14.6 million suspicious messages, and the vast majority of them were being evaluated but not blocked, in the same time period, that has plummeted to 150,000 messages. And of those messages, 99.74% are being blocked by the implementation of that DMARC reject policy. So this is the biggest single step jump you can make in terms of reducing spoofing and business email compromise in one go, is implementing DMARC. But it takes a skilled business partner with the consultancy knowledge to help you and guide you through it and to take some of the heavy lifting away. If you try to do it yourself, it is a tough ask and it will take a lot of time. And that's why Proofpoint's solution for email fraud defense is as much about our consultancy expertise, which is built in as part of our EFD offering. Okay, so that's it from me in terms of email fraud defense. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Simon.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everyone for joining today. I think Tim made the point fairly comprehensively there that end users are still your biggest risk. So I'm going to call it Wombat briefly, only because that was the branding that was previously known. Proofpoint Security Awareness Training is obviously new for 2019. But Wombat Security essentially came from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. So unlike a lot of our competitors in the space, we've come from education rather than the threat or hacker side. We've been named a leader for the 5th consecutive year in computer-based training, and we work with organizations that range from having 10 employees up to 500,000. What we do is actually quite simple. So firstly, we give you the ability to get a complete and accurate assessment of your current level of end user risk. You'll have an awareness, maybe it's slightly anecdotal, that maybe Dave in finance or Laura in HR is a little bit unaware of some of the threats that are out there. They don't know what phishing perhaps even is. So they're quite prime candidates to be falling for phishing simulation, phishing scams and that kind of thing. So we have tools through assessments and phishing simulation that allow you to get a very accurate profile for every single end user that you have. You can then obviously combine that into a view for a particular department or particular location and give you a rich tapestry of data in terms of who your most attacked people are and those users that are most susceptible, and also those that exhibit behavior that is not ideal. We then take that data and take those scores that people have got in assessments and phishing simulation and their profile, and then give them the ability to increase their awareness through our training modules. We adopt something called our continuous training methodology, which sounds very grandiose, but essentially means you do not do once a year classroom-based training. You don't do one-off training and think, okay, we've ticked the compliance box, we can now move on. Everyone's going to be more aware. There's a figure that if you don't use information on a daily basis that you pick up in a particular lesson, you forget 90% of that information within 30 days. So it's essential that the process is not a one-off quick fix and actually continues throughout the year. As I mentioned, we conduct assessments through simulated attacks and knowledge assessments. Our CyberStrength assessments are designed to get a benchmark for every single end user in terms of their knowledge of the threats that are out there. The assessments can be very general across all areas of cybersecurity, so social engineering, PII, phishing, email security in general, mobile app security, and so on. But they also include things like travel security and essentials for executives, so they do go a bit wider than the traditional cyber area. But essentially it gives you a baseline figure for every employee to understand, okay, it might be that Simon Pardy or Tim Ricketts are scoring 65% in their general knowledge of threats that are out there. So we know the percentage improvement we need to make to get them up to speed in terms of their knowledge level. We then auto-enroll those users based on their lack of knowledge into training modules that are relevant for the topics that they're failing on. These are available in 35 plus languages. You can also create your own custom content and questions that are specific to your organization and specific to the policies that you have. We combine these assessments with our phishing simulation tool. We have actually got now over 1,000 different simulation templates that have got things like an O365 credential phishing page. We have them for LinkedIn, Adobe, and so on. Essentially to look as authentic as possible, so that it allows you the ability to send your end users an email which could appear very legitimate, could be something that they would fall for, and it's designed to get them to click on the link, get them to fill out the credential page. They're then taken through to a page which says, whoops, you've done something wrong here, you've fallen for a simulated phish. Luckily, it was one that your company sent out, so there's no further action, but we would like you to take a training content module to understand why you shouldn't have done that and be able to spot that kind of email in the future. The obvious reason being is if you don't have end users that are aware of that kind of scenario and aware of phishing as a topic, then they could actually fall for a real world phish that comes in and then give their credentials away, and as Tim mentioned earlier, the keys to the kingdom and access to different accounts. Because of the culmination and work we've done with Proofpoint, we now have the ability to create very realistic phishing templates. Based on the fact that Proofpoint see 27% of the world's emails on a daily basis, we now have some very, very convincing examples that come into our clients. These are obviously taken out of circulation, made safe, and then we make copies of these that allow you to then go and phish your users with real-world examples in a safe way, and also allow the library of templates to keep ever increasing. Again, that auto-enrollment piece is key for end users that do click on those emails and do fall for those phishing simulations, they're then auto-enrolled into training to help stop them making the same mistake in future. The next part of what we do is, once we understand the gaps in people's knowledge and perhaps they fall in for a phishing simulation, we then train the users. Our training is based on our SaaS LMS. The content is also available via SCORM format, so you can run it from an LMS you may already have. We have 35 plus modules that include everything, as I mentioned, from PCI, social engineering, even GDPR. And the content is about presenting concepts and procedures together. It's based on learning science principles, and the lessons themselves are typically 6 to 7 minutes in length. They're very much bite-sized. The environments are story-based, you get immediate feedback, and the tone is very conversational. We also don't advocate video-based learning. Video tends to be quite passive. All of our content is engaging, and you have to answer questions on what you've seen to demonstrate the understanding. We don't, as I said, advocate video-based learning, the reason being someone can press play on a video, walk away from their PC, come back with a cup of coffee, and the video is completed. Oh, I've done my training. Well, no, you haven't. You haven't actually engaged with the content at all. It's also available in 35 plus languages, and that includes localizations. The key with this is that if people receive training that can appear perhaps very American, we're an American-based company, then the content doesn't really engage them. They feel like it's not been designed for them, and they won't take it. So we localize the content by changing the references within the content. So, for example, if you're taking the content in France, it will refer to a French bank, in Germany, a German bank, and so on. Things like dates and currencies are also changed for the local language that the recipient is taking the training in. That came about because of a situation in the early days of Wombat, as it was in 2008, where we thought we would sell our training in the UK. We thought, okay, so US and UK English are fairly similar. It's an easy market for us to go into. And there was a reference in the training to cubicles. In the US, a cubicle obviously is the desks you sit at. In the UK, a cubicle is a toilet. So that particular piece of content needs to be changed because the end users have found it comical. They didn't engage with the training, they didn't look at it properly, and they certainly didn't have any user behavior change as a result of what they were doing. The next part of what we do is to reinforce that messaging from the training. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't keep reinforcing information on a daily basis or regular basis after training, then people start to lose that information. So we have got short video clips designed as awareness pieces to reinforce, not as full training. Articles and posters that are help to, or you can put up in common areas to try and encourage the users to remember that particular information. Screensavers and things are also available. One of the key elements we now have is a product called PhishAlarm. PhishAlarm is a plugin that sits in the Outlook or O365 ribbon and essentially allows the end user to alert the InfoSec team when they see an email that they believe could be malicious. Obviously, that would be someone who's been on their Wombat or Proofpoint security awareness training. They now know how to spot a phishing email and what it might look like based on various characteristics and attributes within the email. They can click that button, and that will then forward the email with all the information required for the InfoSec team to go and investigate. We've now taken that a step deeper with PhishAlarm and Analyzer, which will take that email that the users clicked and forwarded to then give it a score. So 1 being it's likely to be a phish, 2 it's possibly, and 3 unlikely to be a phish. We will never say definitively yes or no because that's for the threat and security analysts to investigate, but it gives them an indication in terms of priority order which they should investigate first. Because of the work we've done with Proofpoint, we can now even go a step deeper than that, and combining it with TRAP, which is Threat Response Auto Pull, we've created the closed loop email analysis and response, or CLEAR as it's known here, which allows the end user to click on the PhishAlarm button. That reports the potential phish to PhishAlarm Analyzer, which gives it a score, but it also sends the email through to an abuse box monitored by TRAP, which combines the Proofpoint threat intelligence tools to essentially say, we do believe this email is a phish, or we don't believe this email is a phish. If it's deemed to be a phish, it can then be automatically pulled from everyone else's inbox of the organization. So you've had a user there go from being perhaps a user who was scoring quite poorly in the initial assessments and getting a 50–60% score, demonstrating they don't know what phishing is. They've been through their training, so they can now understand what phishing is, they can spot potential phish, and they can then actually become the last line of defense at the organization to protect end users from phishing threats. Because they've clicked on that button, which they know how to use because of their training, and they've then made everyone else in the organization safe from that particular email. The last thing we do at Proofpoint Security Awareness Training is we measure the results. We do that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, to close the loop and understand that Tim Ricketts has gone from scoring 65% to 95% in his CyberStrength assessments. He's also now not clicking on phishing simulations that we sent him. So we've seen a massive improvement in his scores, and we can then see that there is actually still a 5% gap. So we might want to put him back on some training that will then help him improve that knowledge even further and improve his behavior and reduce his level of risk to the organization. The second reason we measure is to essentially demonstrate a return on the investment. So the fact that his scores have gone up, as they will have done for everyone else in different departments, different teams, different locations, and so on, at the same time, coupled with the fact that the click rate has gone down on phishing simulations, mean that you can see that the investment with Proofpoint Security Awareness Training was worthwhile. We have a figure from a case study which we can share with anyone who'd like to see it after the call. But essentially, an organisation, a large bank in the UK, had an over 50% click rate on phishing simulations when we first started working with them. After a couple of months of working with them, they reduced that to single figures. So the training works and essentially does what it says on the tin. That's everything I have from the security awareness side of things. So any questions at all at this stage, and open up to the panel.
Hi, so we have one, and I think this is for Simon. If anybody else has any other questions, please post them now and we can field them. So this is about the training. Does the training include reference to meeting regulations, for example, GDPR? If so, is this localized?
So what was the first part of the question? I heard the GDPR part. I missed the first part.
So does the training include reference to meeting regulations?
It does, yes. So we have two modules deal specifically with GDPR. One was GDPR overview, which was before the regulation was released, and one is GDPR in action, which now obviously references the legislation and provides compliance with that regulation.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions? We don't have any at the moment. We just give it a moment or two and see if any more comes through. Sorry, the second part wasn't answered. Is it answered? Is it localized? Was the second part?
In terms of being specific to different countries within the EU or worldwide?
I'm not sure.
So the content of every module will be localized. So any reference within that module, I can check with the team if in terms of compliance and what it does, whether it's just to do with the regulation itself or whether it's different by different country and the regulations required there.
Okay, we've got another example of it here. So all New York NTDFS, for instance.
Sorry, can you say that again, please?
So all New York NTDFS, for instance.
I'm unsure, so I have to go and check with the team on that one.
Okay, so we'll get back to, if you could then email me the answer to that. We could...
Absolutely.
So then we've got another question. So is the awareness training delivered over a program, example 1 year, 2 year, etc.?
Yes. So with every new customer we have a customer engagement manager who works with the client across the implementation period, which is typically 4 to 6 weeks. And during that time frame, they will put together a program of training, whether it's a 1, 2, or 3 year program based obviously on the agreement we have in place, which is specific to your organization. So that will be based on organizations of similar size that we worked with before. And we can recommend that you do perhaps 1 phishing simulation in the first month with an assessment, then maybe 2 training modules in month 2, maybe 1 module with a specific group in month 3, and so on. The reason being is you obviously don't want to give everyone all 35 modules in one go because they frankly won't help. They won't thank you for that. And it also means that you're getting the best response in terms of engagement. People will then take the training if they've only got a couple of modules to do. If you give them too much, it tends to switch them off to the program. But yes, we will recommend a program for you, and there'll be an iterative process in terms of sign off for that. And we can put that package together for you.
Okay, great. And I think that is everything from now, unless... Yeah, I think that's everything. So thank you everybody for joining us. And as I've said before, we will be sending out the presentation afterwards. And if you could just take the time to quickly fill out the survey. Thank you to our presenters. It was a insightful presentation that we had from you. Thanks everybody, and bye.
Thanks very much.